Tonight, we are stepping through a very old door. Not a door made of iron or oak, though those will certainly appear in the story ahead. This is a different kind of door. One that has been locked, guarded, whispered about, feared, worshipped, condemned, and misunderstood for centuries. Behind it, there are candlelit rooms and velvet aprons. There are passwords spoken in hushed voices, handshakes exchanged in the dark, and rituals so old that the men performing them no longer remembered exactly where they came from. There are stonemasons with dusty hands, philosophers sipping wine by firelight, presidents and composers, and generals and kings, all of them at some point nodding toward the same slow, ancient flame. This is the history of the Freemasons, not the version the conspiracy theories tell, not the version designed to frighten or astonish you, the real version, the one buried under centuries of rumor and myth and deliberate silence, the one that, if you let it settle into you slowly, like warmth from a dying fire, is actually quite calm, quite human, and quite beautiful in its own strange, secretive way. So let the room go quiet. Pull whatever you have around you just a little tighter. You don't need to follow every word. Just let the story wash over you like slow water, carrying you gently through centuries, through lodges and cathedrals and smoke-filled taverns and torch-lit meeting halls, until eventually you find yourself drifting somewhere soft and still and dark, exactly where you were always headed tonight. And before we go any further, just a quick word from your host. If these slow, soothing journeys through history are helping you find rest, it would mean the world to me if you liked this video and subscribed to the channel. We are on our way to 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you is a real part of that. Hit like, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if you've got any sleepy hype left in you tonight, send it our way. It genuinely helps more than you can imagine. Now, back to the door. Part 1. The world behind closed doors. There is something deeply human about the idea of a secret. Long before writing existed, before cities, before the wheel, people gathered in circles and shared things that were not meant for everyone. They drew on cave walls in firelight. They whispered names for things that the uninitiated were not allowed to hear. There were rites of passage, initiation ceremonies, tests of worthiness. The idea that certain knowledge must be earned, that certain truths are only available to those who have proven themselves ready to receive them. This is not a modern idea, and it is certainly not a sinister one. It is one of the oldest impulses in human history. The Freemasons did not invent secrecy, but they refined it into something extraordinary. They took an ancient instinct, the desire to gather, to belong, to carry a shared weight of meaning, and they built it into a structure so layered, so symbolic, and so deliberately preserved that it has survived for centuries, outlasting empires and revolutions, and the scorn of popes and dictators alike.
When most people hear the word Freemason, they picture one of two things. Either they imagine the sinister version, shadowy figures pulling strings behind the scenes of governments and banks and international power, secret rooms in Washington monuments, hidden messages on dollar bills, a global fraternity of elites whispering the fates of nations into each other's ears. Or they imagine the more mundane version, An old men's club with funny aprons, meeting in a lodge somewhere in a small town, raising money for local charities and arguing about whose turn it is to run the raffle. The truth, as is almost always the case, lives somewhere in between those two images, but also somewhere more interesting than either of them. The Freemasons are the oldest existing secular fraternal organization in the world. They trace their roots to the stone-cutting guilds of medieval Europe, to the men who raised cathedrals from nothing, who carved the faces of saints into limestone 100 feet above the ground, who knew the secrets of load-bearing arches and the ancient mathematics of proportion. From those practical, calloused hands, something philosophical grew, something that would eventually touch the Enlightenment, the American and French revolutions, the lives of composers and explorers and heads of state, something that would be banned, burned, persecuted, celebrated, mythologized and whispered about in nearly every corner of the world. And it all began, as most extraordinary things begin, very quietly, with a group of working men doing difficult and dangerous work and deciding that some of what they knew was worth protecting.
The story you are about to hear spans more than 7 centuries. It begins in the cold, stone-scattered yards of medieval building sites, where men wore leather aprons not as symbols, but as practical protection against sharp edges and rough surfaces. It passes through the coffee houses and taverns of 18th century London, where educated men gathered to argue about God and reason and the nature of the universe. It crosses the Atlantic with the men who founded America, and filters back across the sea into the salons of revolutionary France, the churches of Rome, the courts of European kings, who found the organization either indispensable or terrifying, and sometimes both. This is a story about belonging, about what happens when men who are not supposed to mix, different classes, different faiths, different professions, sit down together in a room with closed doors and agree to treat each other as brothers. It is a story about symbols and what they mean, about ritual and why it matters, about the very human need to mark a passage from one version of yourself to a better one. It is also, in places, a story about fear, because few things frighten the powerful quite as much as a group of people meeting in private and refusing to say exactly why. So dim the lights, let the evening settle, and let us begin at the beginning, in the dust and cold of medieval Europe, at the base of a cathedral that hadn't yet been built. Part 2. The Stone and the Secret. Medieval Stonemason Guilds. Imagine a building site in England, sometime in the 13th century. The year doesn't matter exactly. What matters is the mud, the cold, and the sheer, staggering scale of what is being attempted. A cathedral is going up. Not a small chapel or a simple church, but a full cathedral. A building so tall it strains credulity. A building whose spires will be visible for miles in every direction. A building whose interior will be so high and so lit with colored glass that stepping inside it will feel less like entering a structure and more like walking into a painting of heaven. The men building this cathedral are skilled in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. They are working without calculators, without computer modeling, without modern engineering software of any kind. They are working with geometry learned from ancient texts, with proportional ratios memorized and passed down through years of apprenticeship,
with an understanding of stress and load and the behavior of stone under compression that exists entirely in their heads and in their hands. They are stonemasons, and they are remarkable. Stonemasons in medieval Europe were not ordinary labourers. There were ordinary labourers on building sites, certainly, people who dug foundations and carried rubble and mixed mortar, but the stonemasons were a different class entirely. They were craftsmen of the highest order, men who had spent years learning their trade, who could look at a rough block of stone and understand exactly where to strike it, how to shape it, what it would become. They travelled from project to project across Europe, following the great cathedrals and castles as they rose, carrying their tools and their knowledge with them. And that knowledge was their most valuable possession.
The secrets of stonework in the medieval period were not trivial. They included geometric knowledge that had been inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, filtered through Islamic scholarship and monastic learning. They included understanding of the pointed arch and the flying buttress, the two innovations that made the soaring Gothic cathedrals possible. A mason who understood these principles was not just a craftsman. He was something closer to an engineer, an architect, and a mathematician rolled into one leather-aproned figure with calloused hands. To protect that knowledge, stonemasons formed guilds. A guild in the medieval period was a professional organization that controlled admission to a trade, set standards for quality and conduct, and looked after the welfare of its members. There were guilds for bakers, for tanners, for weavers, for goldsmiths. The stonemason guilds were among the most complex and secretive because the knowledge they protected was so technically valuable and so difficult to acquire. Entry into the guild was strictly controlled. A young man who wanted to become a stonemason would first serve as an apprentice, attached to a master mason, living in his household, learning the basic techniques of the craft. This apprenticeship typically lasted 7 years. At the end of it, if the master was satisfied, the young man would be formally entered into the guild, accepted as a fellow of the craft or journeyman, allowed to travel and work independently, though not yet to take on his own apprentices.
The highest rank was master mason. A master had full command of the craft's secrets, could take on apprentices of his own, and could oversee entire building projects. The transition from journeyman to master was not simply a matter of skill. It involved a formal recognition from the guild, a ceremony of some kind, and an oath. Those oaths mattered enormously. A guild member who revealed the secrets of the craft to someone outside the guild was not merely breaking a professional rule, he was violating a sworn promise. In a world where oaths were taken with deep religious seriousness, where breaking your word was a moral failing of the gravest kind, this was a powerful bind. The early stonemason guilds also had something else that would become central to Freemasonry, a system of signs and passwords. When a stonemason arrived in a new town looking for work, he needed a way to prove to local masons that he was who he claimed to be. There were no identity cards, no certificates. So instead, there were grips, specific ways of shaking hands that conveyed information. There were words, spoken in particular contexts, that proved membership without requiring any documentation. A true member of the guild would know how to give the grip and speak the word. An impostor would not. This system of recognition was deeply practical, but over time it became something more. It became symbolic. The grip was not just proof of training, it was a bond. The word was not just a password, it was a connection to all the other men who had spoken it before you, in other towns, at other building sites, across decades and generations.
the lodges where stonemasons gathered, the temporary huts built on building sites to store tools and shelter workers during breaks, took on social and ceremonial significance. Rules were established for behavior inside the lodge. Disputes were settled there. New members were formally welcomed there. A sense of ritual began to grow around the practical business of running a building site. These early lodges were, in a very direct sense, the origin of everything that Freemasonry would eventually become. The apron worn by the Master Mason is still worn by Freemasons today, changed in material from rough leather to fine white lambskin, but still the same basic garment, still heavy with the same ancestral meaning. The square and compass, the primary symbols of Freemasonry, are the actual tools of the stonemason's trade. The square used to test whether angles are true, the compass used to draw circles and arcs and design. Even the 3 degrees of modern Freemasonry, entered apprentice, fellow craft and master mason, mirror almost exactly the 3 stages of the medieval stonemason's career. The men who would one day meet in the taverns of London and call themselves Freemasons were not inventing something entirely new. They were inheriting something ancient, something that had been quietly passed down through the hands and words of working men for longer than any of them could clearly trace. They were receiving a legacy of stone and shadow, of earned knowledge and sworn brotherhood that stretched back to the cold, magnificent yards where the cathedrals of Europe first rose toward the sky. And they would make something extraordinary of it. Somewhere in the British Library, under controlled temperature and very careful archival conditions, there is a small manuscript. It is written on vellum, prepared animal skin, not paper, in a hand that scholars date to somewhere between 1390 and 1425. It is 64 pages long. It is written in verse, in a form of Middle English that requires careful reading even for specialists. And it is, as far as anyone can tell, the oldest surviving written document connected to Freemasonry. It is called the Regius manuscript. Sometimes it is called the Halliwell manuscript, after the man who first brought it to scholarly attention in the 19th century. And the fact that it exists at all is remarkable, not because the document itself is especially dramatic, it isn't, but because it gives us a window into a world that otherwise left almost no written record. The poem, as it opens, tells a legend. It says that the craft of masonry began with Euclid, the ancient Greek mathematician who taught geometry in Egypt. It says that the knowledge traveled from Egypt to various parts of the ancient world, eventually reaching England during the reign of King Athelstan, who ruled in the early 10th century. The poem says that Athelstan called a great assembly of masons and had their customs and regulations written down, establishing formal rules for the craft in England.
Historians treat the historical claims in the Regius poem with appropriate skepticism. The idea that masonry in England traces directly back to Euclid is legendary rather than factual. But what matters about the poem is not its historical accuracy. What matters is what it tells us about how medieval stonemasons understood themselves. They believed their knowledge was ancient. They believed it had been handed down through a long, distinguished lineage stretching back to the learned masters of antiquity. They took their craft seriously enough to write a poem about its origins and to set down its rules in formal verse. The poem contains what it calls charges, rules governing the behavior of masons. These rules are detailed and striking in their comprehensiveness. They include directions about how an apprentice should behave towards his master. They specify that a mason should not steal from his employer, should not commit adultery, should not slander his fellows. They say that disputes among masons should be settled within the guild rather than taken to outside courts. They speak of the duty of every mason to keep the secrets of the craft, to neither write them down nor speak them to anyone who has not been formally admitted. And then there is this, buried in the lines of the poem, easy to miss if you are not looking, a reference to words and signs by which masons recognized one another. Signs and words, a system of secret identification, in a poem written more than 600 years ago.
Later manuscripts, there are nearly 200 surviving medieval Masonic manuscripts, collectively called the Old Charges, expand on this. They trace the history of Masonry not just to Euclid, but further back to figures from the Bible. One tradition connects Masonry to the children of Lamech, a figure mentioned in the book of Genesis. Another connects it to the building of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, a connection that would become one of the most central and enduring mythologies of Freemasonry. The builders of Solomon's Temple were, in medieval imagination, the supreme exemplars of the mason's craft, men who had worked on a building of divine commission, men whose knowledge was sacred because the work itself had been commanded by God. This idea that the stonemason's craft is connected to something sacred, that the act of building is a kind of participation in divine order, ran deep through medieval Christian culture. The cathedral builders were not simply constructing useful buildings, they were building houses for God. The perfection of their geometry was a reflection of the divine perfection of creation. The height of their arches was a gesture towards heaven. Their work was devotional in the most literal sense. It was an act of worship expressed in stone. When the guild began to absorb these mythological and religious associations into its ceremonies, something shifted. The practical business of the building site began to acquire philosophical weight. The tools of the trade began to carry moral meaning. The square that tested true angles became a symbol of moral rectitude, the quality of being square in your dealings with others. The level became a symbol of equality. The rough stone that the apprentice worked on and eventually refined into a smooth, regular block became a metaphor for the work of moral and intellectual self-improvement. These symbolic translations, from physical tool to moral principle, from practical skill to philosophical virtue, are the heart of what Freemasonry would eventually become. But in the time of the Regius manuscript, they were not yet fully formed. They were tendencies, inclinations, seeds. The flower was still centuries away. What the manuscript gives us is a glimpse of the soil, a community of skilled workers, bound by oaths, organized by secret signs and words, governed by rules they took seriously enough to write down in verse. Men who understood their work as meaningful, not just economically, but morally and spiritually. Men who had something worth protecting and knew it. The door of the lodge was already closing quietly behind them. Part 4. From Operative to Speculative, when non-Masons entered the lodge. There is a moment in the history of Freemasonry that is difficult to pin down precisely, because it did not happen all at once. It happened gradually, in different lodges, in different places, over the course of several decades in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. But it is the hinge on which everything turns. It is the moment when the stonemasons' guild began to admit people who were not stonemasons. This transition from what historians call operative masonry to speculative masonry
is arguably the single most important development in the history of the entire organization. Without it, Freemasonry would have remained a trade guild, eventually fading as the great age of cathedral building ended. Because of it, Freemasonry became something entirely different, a philosophical brotherhood that would eventually circle the entire globe. The practical reasons for the change are fairly straightforward. The great age of cathedral building in Europe was essentially over by the 16th century. The reformations of the church, the shifts in architectural fashion, the economic upheavals of the period, all of these meant that the massive, long-term stone construction projects that had sustained the Mason guilds for centuries were becoming rarer. The lodges were losing members, their numbers were thinning, and some of them began to look for a different kind of recruit.
In Scotland, the records are particularly good. The Lodge of Edinburgh, also known as Mary's Chapel, has records going back to 1599, making it the oldest documented Masonic lodge in the world with continuous records. And those records show something interesting. By the early 17th century, the lodge had admitted members who were clearly not working stonemasons, a lawyer, a goldsmith, men whose trades had nothing to do with cutting stone. These were the earliest accepted or speculative masons, men who joined the lodge not for professional reasons, but for the fellowship, the ritual, the philosophy, and perhaps the practical social advantages of belonging to a network of trusted men. Why would a lawyer or a goldsmith want to join a stonemason's guild? Several reasons. The lodges offered something genuinely rare in the early modern period, a space where men of different social classes could meet on equal terms. The master of a lodge was honored not because of his birth or his wealth, but because of his Masonic rank, which depended on his character and knowledge. The rich man and the skilled craftsman sat together and called each other brother. In a rigidly stratified society, this was almost revolutionary. There was also the intellectual appeal. The speculative masons were drawn to the symbolic system that had grown up around the craft, the moral meanings of the tools, the philosophical interpretations of the building trade. For educated men with an interest in philosophy, theology, and the emerging sciences of the Enlightenment period, this was fertile ground. Here was a system of symbols that could be read as a complete moral and philosophical curriculum. The square and compass were not just tools, they were a language in which the whole of ethical life could be expressed.
And there was the ritual. Human beings have always been drawn to meaningful ceremony. The initiation rites of the stonemason guilds, the formal acceptance of a new member, the taking of oaths, the transmission of secret signs and words, carried a weight and gravity that was deeply appealing to men who found ordinary social life thin and unsatisfying. There was something serious and old about it, something that connected them, however symbolically, to a long lineage of working men and ancient builders, stretching back to Solomon's Temple and beyond. By the mid-17th century, the balance had shifted considerably. Many lodges in England and Scotland contained more speculative members than operative ones. The stonemasons were becoming a minority in their own lodges, and the nature of what those lodges were for, what they were actually doing when they met, what they believed, what they were trying to become, was quietly but fundamentally changing. The ritual was becoming more elaborate, the philosophical content was deepening. The 3 degrees were taking on more complex symbolic meanings. The story of Hiram Abiff, the legendary master builder of Solomon's Temple, was being woven into the ceremony of the third degree in ways that transformed a simple initiation into something approaching a dramatic mystery play, complete with death and resurrection, and a profound meditation on the nature of loyalty, knowledge, and mortality.
These developments did not happen in isolation. They were occurring in a period of intense intellectual and political ferment in England. The Civil War had ripped the country apart. The restoration of the monarchy had brought its own upheavals. The Royal Society, that extraordinary gathering of natural philosophers who were in the process of inventing what we now call science, was being formed. Men were rethinking everything: the nature of government, the role of religion, the structure of the universe. The lodges were part of that ferment. They were spaces where new ideas could be discussed among men who were bound by oath to keep those discussions private, where a Catholic and a Protestant might sit beside each other and explore philosophical questions without the conversation degenerating into the sectarian violence that had consumed so much of Europe, where a nobleman and a craftsman could, at least within the walls of the lodge, acknowledge each other's equal humanity. Something was being built in those rooms, not from stone, but from ideas and oaths and shared ceremony, and it would eventually need a more formal structure to contain it. Part 5. The Birth of Modern Freemasonry, 1717 and the Grand Lodge of England. On the 24th of June, in the year 1717, 4 lodges in London met at a tavern called the Goose and Gridiron Ale-house in St. Paul's Churchyard. They were not particularly grand lodges. They met, as English lodges typically did, in the back rooms of public houses, the kind of warm, slightly smoky, ale-scented rooms that formed the social fabric of Georgian London. The occasion was the Feast of St. John the Baptist, a date with traditional significance in the Masonic calendar. And at that meeting, in that tavern, they founded the Grand Lodge of England, the first Grand Lodge in the world, the organizational structure from which modern Freemasonry descends. This is generally considered the birth date of modern Freemasonry, though the organization claims continuity with the much older stonemason traditions. What the 1717 founding provided was governance. Before the Grand Lodge, English lodges operated independently, each with its own customs and practices and degrees, without any overarching authority to standardize or coordinate. The Grand Lodge brought the lodges together under a shared constitutional framework, with a single governing body, elected officers, and official records. The first Grand Master, the title given to the head of the Grand Lodge, was a man named Anthony Sayer. He was not a particularly grand figure by the standards of the day. He was a gentleman of modest means, and some records suggest he eventually fell into poverty. But he presided over the meeting at the Goose and Gridiron, and his name is therefore the first in a long line that stretches down to the present day. More significant for the development of Freemasonry's philosophy and public character was a man named James Anderson, a Scottish Presbyterian minister who was commissioned by the Grand Lodge to compile what became known as the Constitutions of the Freemasons, published in 1723. Anderson's Constitutions are a remarkable document. They set out the history of Masonry, beginning in true Masonic fashion with Euclid and Solomon's Temple, and working forward to the present, and they articulate a set of principles that would define Freemasonry's character for centuries. Among the most striking of Anderson's charges is this one, on the subject of religion. A Mason is obliged by his tenure to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understands the art, He will never be a stupid atheist, nor an irreligious libertine. But though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country or nation, yet 'tis now thought more expedient only to oblige them to that religion in which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves. This was, for 1723, a radical statement. It meant that the Grand Lodge of England was deliberately opening Freemasonry to men of all Christian denominations, and by implication, to men of any faith that acknowledged a supreme being. Protestant and Catholic, Jew and Quaker could all be Freemasons. The only requirement was a belief in God, though the specific nature of that God was left to the individual conscience. In an age of violent religious division, an age that had seen wars of religion tear Europe apart for more than a century, this was a profound and deliberate choice. It made the lodge a genuinely unusual space, a place where religious identity was checked at the door, where men agreed to set aside the disagreements that had caused such suffering and simply treat each other as brothers. The Grand Lodge also helped standardize the 3 degrees that would become the core of Masonic initiation: Entered Apprentice, Fellowcraft, and Master Mason. These 3 degrees were not new. They had evolved from the 3 ranks of the stonemason guilds, but under the Grand Lodge they acquired a more formal structure, a more elaborate ritual, and a more explicitly philosophical content.
Within a few years of the Grand Lodge's founding, Freemasonry began to spread with extraordinary speed. New lodges formed in England, Scotland, and Ireland. By the 1720s, lodges were appearing in continental Europe. By the 1730s, they had crossed the Atlantic to the American colonies. By the middle of the century, there were lodges in India, in the Caribbean, in South America. The speed of Freemasonry's global expansion in the 18th century is remarkable. It moved faster than almost any other voluntary organization in human history. Part of the reason was the network effect. Merchants, soldiers, sailors, and officials who were Freemasons could walk into a lodge in any city in the world and find brotherhood. They would be recognized by their signs and their words. They would be received as brothers. They would have access to a network of trusted men who were bound by oath to help them. In an age without telephones, without instant communication, without the social infrastructure that we now take for granted, this was enormously valuable. Part of it was also simply the appeal of the thing. The rituals were compelling, the philosophy was serious and intellectually satisfying, the fellowship was genuine. Men who joined the lodges tended to stay, and they tended to bring their friends. The door that had opened quietly in the back rooms of London taverns was now open to the world, and the world, it turned out, was very interested in walking through it. Part 6, the 3 degrees: Apprentice, Fellowcraft, and Master Mason.
To understand Freemasonry from the inside, not the version of it that appears in conspiracy theories, but the version that its members actually experience, you need to understand the 3 degrees. Because the degrees are not just organizational ranks. They are, in the full Masonic understanding of them, a complete philosophical and moral curriculum. They are a journey, and like all real journeys, they change the person who makes them. The first degree is the entered apprentice. A man who wishes to join a Masonic lodge, and it is, in most traditional jurisdictions, still a men-only organization, though some modern lodges have opened to women, must first be proposed by an existing member, seconded by another, and approved by the lodge. He cannot seek out Freemasonry and demand admission. The tradition requires that he ask, that he knock at the door, that his seeking be genuine and his approach humble.
The initiation ceremony for the first degree is one of the most carefully preserved rituals in the organization. The details vary slightly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and many of them are kept private, but the broad outline is known because disgruntled former members have published accounts of it for as long as Freemasonry has existed. The candidate is prepared outside the lodge room. He is dressed in a particular way, one trouser leg rolled up, one shoe removed, the left breast of his shirt opened. He is blindfolded with what the Masons call a hoodwink. A noose, called a cable tow, is placed loosely around his neck. He is led to the door of the lodge, and there he knocks.
The symbolism of this preparation is deliberate and layered. The blindfold represents the candidate's current state, in darkness, ignorant of the light and knowledge that Freemasonry claims to offer. The partial undressing represents vulnerability, openness, the willingness to approach something unknown without the armor of social pretension. The cable tow represents the bond of obligation, the fact that the candidate is about to take on something serious, something binding. He is asked what he seeks. He says he seeks light, and the door opens. Inside, he is led through the lodge room by a guide called the junior deacon, while the officers of the lodge perform the ceremony around him. He takes an obligation, a solemn oath on whatever holy book is relevant to his faith, swearing to keep the secrets of the degree, to behave toward his fellow Masons with brotherhood and honesty, to seek the welfare of the lodge and its members. At the climax of the ceremony, the blindfold is removed. Light floods in. The symbolism is direct. He has passed from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge. He is given the grip, the word, and the sign of the entered apprentice. He is now, in the Masonic understanding, a beginner, not yet knowing much, but having crossed the threshold and accepted the responsibility of seeking more.
The second degree, the fellowcraft, deepens the philosophical content. Where the first degree deals largely with the themes of birth, initiation, and the beginning of moral inquiry, the second degree deals with education and the pursuit of knowledge. The fellowcraft is represented as a man in the middle of his journey, no longer a raw beginner, not yet a master. He is encouraged to pursue learning across the full range of human knowledge, the liberal arts and sciences, the study of nature, the exploration of all that human reason can illuminate. The fellowcraft degree involves a symbolic journey up the winding staircase of Solomon's temple, an ascent through the liberal arts, which in the medieval tradition consisted of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The Masonic tradition adds its own emphases, particularly on geometry, which it treats as the mother of all sciences and the foundation of the Mason's craft. There is something touching about this, actually, the idea that a group of men meeting in a rented room above a pub in Georgian London would structure their philosophical curriculum around the same medieval framework that had been used to educate scholars in cathedral schools 600 years earlier. The third degree, the Master Mason, is the most dramatic and the most philosophically complex of the three. It centers on a story, a legend, a narrative that has been at the heart of Freemasonry since at least the early 18th century and possibly earlier. It is the story of Hiram Abiff, and it deserves a section all to itself. Part 7. The Legend of Hiram Abiff, the sacred story at the heart of the craft.
In the Book of Kings in the Old Testament, there is a brief mention of a craftsman named Hiram. He is described as a man of great skill, sent by the king of Tyre to help Solomon build his temple in Jerusalem. He worked with bronze, making pillars and ornamental features for the temple. He appears in a few verses and then disappears from the biblical narrative without particular ceremony. Freemasonry took this minor biblical figure and built around him one of the most emotionally powerful ritual narratives in the history of any fraternal organization. In the Masonic legend, Hiram Abiff is not just a craftsman, he is the Grand Master Architect of Solomon's Temple. He is the possessor of the Master's Word, a secret, the most profound secret of the craft, the name of God, or perhaps something equivalent in its importance. He is the model of every virtue that Freemasonry honors: skill, loyalty, integrity, and above all, the willingness to die rather than betray his oath. The legend goes like this. 3 workmen on the temple, in Masonic tradition called the Ruffians, and given the names Jubila, Jubilo, and Jubilem, though the names vary somewhat, want to know the Master's Word before they have earned the right to it. They believe that with the word they will be able to pass themselves off as Master Masons elsewhere, claiming wages and privileges they have not earned. Each of the 3, separately, confronts Hiram Abiff and demands the word. Each time Hiram refuses. He tells them the word cannot be given except in the presence of Solomon, the king of Tyre, and himself together, the 3 grand masters of the temple. He will not reveal it for any price.
The 3rd ruffian strikes Hiram with a setting maul, a heavy mallet used in stonework, and Hiram falls dead. The 3 men bury his body. Solomon notices the absence of his master architect, sends out search parties, and eventually the body is discovered. The secret word is lost. In its place, the Masons adopt a substitute word, a word to stand in for the original until in some future age the true word might be recovered. At the climax of the 3rd degree ceremony, the candidate enacts the role of Hiram Abiff. He is symbolically killed and symbolically raised from the dead by the Grand Master. The raising uses a particular grip, the lion's paw, and a particular whisper. The candidate, lying on the floor of the lodge in symbolic death, is lifted up and given new life, new status, new knowledge. This is no longer a trade guild initiation. This is a mystery play. This is, in its symbolic structure, a story about death and resurrection, about the preservation of sacred knowledge, about the integrity that refuses to be broken, even by death. It is a story that would feel immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the mystery religions of ancient Greece and Rome, the rites of Osiris in Egypt, the Eleusinian mysteries, the various ancient narratives of a god or hero who dies and rises, and in rising confers some gift of knowledge or salvation on the living. Whether this connection is accidental or deliberate is a matter of genuine scholarly debate. Some historians believe the Hiram story developed independently, drawing on biblical sources and the theatrical traditions of the medieval mystery plays. Others believe that some of the early speculative Masons, who were educated men familiar with classical learning, deliberately incorporated ancient religious symbolism into the Masonic ritual. Either way, the result is striking. A ceremony that, when performed well, in the right setting, with the right gravity, is genuinely moving, even transformative. Former Freemasons who have later left the organization and described their experiences often focus on the 3rd degree as the most significant moment of their Masonic career. There is something about lying on the floor of the lodge in the darkness, in the posture of death, and then being lifted up and welcomed into a new fraternal standing. Something about that physical enactment of mortality and renewal that lands with surprising depth,
regardless of whether you believe in any of the specific theology surrounding it. The story of Hiram Abiff also establishes one of Freemasonry's most important principles, that integrity is non-negotiable, that there are things worth more than your life, that the proper response to coercion, to threats, to the demand that you compromise your deepest values is exactly the response that Hiram gave, a quiet, firm refusal, and whatever consequences follow from it. In a world that was full of compromises and corruptions, of men who bent their principles for money or safety or social advancement, this was a striking ideal. It was not always lived up to, of course. No ideal ever is. But it was held, and the holding of it mattered. Part 8. Symbols, Signs and Secrets. The Language of the Lodge.
Walk into a Masonic lodge room, and you will find yourself inside a room that functions in every detail as a symbolic universe. Nothing is arbitrary. The floor may be tiled in alternating black and white squares, representing the duality of existence, the interplay of light and darkness, good and evil, life and death. The ceiling in many lodges is painted or hung to represent the sky, often with stars, the heavens towards which the aspiring Mason directs his moral and intellectual efforts. The east, west and south walls are associated with specific officers and specific phases of the sun's journey. The room is oriented so that the worshipful master, the elected head of the lodge, sits in the east where the sun rises, because in Masonic symbolism, the east is the source of light and wisdom. The three principal officers of a lodge are the worshipful master, the senior warden, and the junior warden. They correspond to the three grand masters of Masonic legend: Solomon, the king of Hiram of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff. The master's pedestal stands on the east side of the room. The warden's pedestals are in the west and south. The candidate moves between these points during the degrees, tracing a path that is itself symbolic, from the north, which is traditionally the place of darkness in Masonic symbolism, towards the east, which is light.
On the pedestal before the worshipful master, there is always the volume of the sacred law, a holy book appropriate to the faith tradition of the lodge's jurisdiction. In most English-speaking lodges, this is the Bible, open to a specific passage. But it can equally be the Quran, the Torah, the Bhagavad Gita, or any other text that the individual Mason holds sacred. On either side of the sacred book are the square and the compasses, the working tools that have become Freemasonry's primary symbols. The square and compasses together form the most recognizable symbol in all of Freemasonry, familiar even to people who know nothing else about the organization. The letter G is often displayed within them, standing variously for God, for geometry, or for the grand architect of the universe, that carefully neutral designation for the divine that allows Freemasons of all faiths to worship the same symbolic deity without agreeing on his specific nature. The apron deserves special mention. Every Freemason wears an apron during lodge ceremonies, and the apron is considered the badge of the craft. New initiates receive a plain white lambskin apron, white for purity, lambskin for innocence and the clean beginning of the Masonic journey. As a Mason advances through degrees and offices, his apron may be elaborated, colored borders, emblems, fringe. A Grand Master's apron is a magnificent object, covered in symbols and embellishments that tell, for those who know how to read them, the complete story of his Masonic career. The tools of the stonemason all carry moral meanings. The gavel, used to knock off the rough and unnecessary parts of a stone, represents the education of conscience, the gradual removal of those habits and vices that prevent us from becoming the better version of ourselves we are capable of being. The chisel represents the sustained effort of improvement, the patient, precise work of moral cultivation. The 24-inch gauge, the ruler used to measure stone, represents the 24 hours of the day, divided in the Masonic teaching into 8 hours of work, 8 of rest, and 8 of service to God and to worthy distressed brothers. The pillars, named Boaz and Jachin, the names of the 2 great pillars that stood at the entrance of Solomon's temple, represent strength and stability. They stand at the entrance of the lodge room, and the candidate passes between them during his initiation, just as the ancient priests and craftsmen would have passed between the pillars of the temple. The all-seeing eye, perhaps the most famous and most misunderstood of all Masonic symbols, represents divine watchfulness. God sees all. The eye is a reminder that the Mason is never unobserved in his moral conduct, that even when no human witness is present, the divine witness is always there. In the Masonic room, the eye is often depicted at the top of a pyramid or triangle, an image that, removed from its context, has generated more conspiracy theory fuel than probably any other symbol in modern culture. On the back of the American $1 bill, an eye in a triangle sits above an unfinished pyramid, and this detail has fueled decades of speculation about Masonic influence in the founding of the American Republic. We will come back to this. The handshakes, formerly called grips or tokens, vary by degree and remain one of the genuinely secret elements of Masonic practice. The specific grip for each degree allows a Mason to identify himself to another Mason without words, a practical remnant of the medieval system for recognizing guild members across distances. There are also signs, specific hand positions or gestures made in lodge ceremonies and used as modes of recognition. And there are words, passwords and sacred words assigned to each degree, whispered rather than spoken aloud, shared only in the context of lodge ceremony or private recognition.
All of these elements together constitute what Freemasons call the modes of recognition, a complete vocabulary of identity and belonging that requires years of active participation to fully learn. A Mason who moves to a new city, walks into an unfamiliar lodge, and demonstrates knowledge of the grips, words, and signs of his degree is immediately recognized as a brother. He will be welcomed, seated, and treated with the full warmth of Masonic fellowship. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this could mean the difference between finding safe shelter and patronage in an unknown place, or being entirely alone in a city full of strangers. The language of the lodge is a secret language in the most complete sense, not just a collection of private passwords, but an entire symbolic vocabulary that transforms the way its speakers see the world. A Freemason looking at a building site sees not just construction, but a moral curriculum. He sees the rough stone of an uninformed conscience, the working tools of moral discipline, the plumb line of upright conduct, the square of honest dealing. The world itself becomes a lodge room. Every experience becomes potentially instructive. This is perhaps the most interesting thing about Masonic symbolism, not its secrecy, but its ambition. The Freemasons took a trade with its physical objects and its practical knowledge and transformed it into a complete philosophy of living.
They built a language from hammers and compasses and levels and aprons, and in that language they described the entire project of being human. Part 9. The Founding Fathers and the Freemasons. America's Masonic Thread.
In October of 1792, in a field that would soon become Washington, D.C., a ceremony was held to mark the laying of the cornerstone of the United States Capitol building. It was conducted in full Masonic regalia by George Washington. The apron he wore that day is preserved at the Museum of American History. It was made of white silk embroidered with symbols of the craft and presented to him by the Marquis de Lafayette. Washington held a gavel and a trowel. He laid the stone with the precision that the Masonic ritual required. He was the President of the United States, the commander who had won the Revolutionary War, and he was also, unmistakably, proudly, a Freemason. George Washington had been initiated into the fraternity at Fredericksburg Lodge in Virginia in 1752, when he was 20 years old. He remained a member for the rest of his life, though he was not an especially active lodge attendee in his later years. The demands of military command and then the presidency left him little time for meetings. But his affiliation was never secret, and he wore it with quiet pride. In a famous portrait painted in 1794, he is depicted in full Masonic regalia, gavel in hand, standing in an attitude of ceremonial dignity.
Washington was far from alone. Benjamin Franklin was a Freemason and served as Grand Master of Pennsylvania. Paul Revere was a Mason and served as Grand Master of Massachusetts. John Hancock was a Mason. James Monroe was a Mason. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President, was a Mason and later served as Grand Master of Tennessee. James Polk was a Mason. James Buchanan was a Mason. Andrew Johnson was a Mason. James Garfield was a Mason. William McKinley was a Mason. Theodore Roosevelt was a Mason. William Howard Taft was a Mason. Warren Harding was a Mason. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a Mason. Harry Truman, who was by many accounts the most enthusiastic Freemason ever to occupy the White House, was a member of multiple Masonic bodies and served as Grand Master of Missouri. This is a striking concentration. Of the first 44 presidents of the United States, at least 14 were confirmed Freemasons. Some researchers claim the number is higher, but those claims involve disputed evidence, and it is better to be conservative. The question that naturally follows is, what does this mean? Does the Masonic affiliation of so many founding fathers prove that the United States was secretly designed as a Masonic project, that its institutions and symbols and principles were secretly encoded with Masonic meaning? The honest answer is, not quite, but not nothing either. The connections are real. The values that Freemasonry promoted in the 18th century, reason over superstition, equality over aristocracy, religious tolerance over sectarian exclusion, personal moral responsibility over institutional authority, are recognizably the same values embedded in the American founding documents. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution breathed the same air as Anderson's Masonic constitutions of 1723. This is not coincidence, but it is also not conspiracy. Both the Masonic philosophy and the political philosophy of the American founders drew from the same source, the Enlightenment. The famous symbols, the pyramid on the dollar bill, the all-seeing eye, are somewhat more complex. The pyramid and the eye appear on what is called the Great Seal of the United States, which was designed in 1782 by Charles Thomson and William Barton. Neither Thomson nor Barton was a Freemason. The pyramid was a symbol of permanence and strength used widely in 18th century iconography. The eye was a common Christian symbol for divine providence, used in churches and theological texts long before Freemasonry adopted it.
Their appearance on the Great Seal is almost certainly not a direct Masonic reference, even though their similarity to certain Masonic symbols is undeniable. But the story once attached to the symbols proved impossible to remove. The combination of real Masonic influence in the founding generation, the presence of certain ambiguously shared symbols, and the general secrecy of the organization created fertile ground for elaboration. By the 19th century, the myth of America as Masonic project was fully formed and circulating freely, and it has never quite stopped circulating since.
What is genuinely striking about the founding generation's relationship with Freemasonry is not the conspiracy, it is the sincerity. Washington laying a cornerstone in his apron, Franklin attending lodges in both Philadelphia and Paris, Revere carrying the traditions of the craft through the upheaval of revolution. These were not men performing a secret rite in a back room. They were men who believed, genuinely, that the values of the craft, brotherhood, equality, moral responsibility, the aspiration toward light, were relevant to the great political project they were undertaking. That building a republic was, in some meaningful sense, the same work as building a temple. That the tools of the mason, the square, the level, the plumb line, were the proper tools for building not just walls, but a civilization. Part 10. The Church Against the Craft, Papal Bans and Religious War. For much of its history, Freemasonry has had a complicated and often hostile relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. The hostility is old and, from the Church's perspective, deeply principled. It has produced some of the most colourful moments in the long institutional combat between a religious authority and a fraternal organisation. The first formal condemnation came in 1738, when Pope Clement XII issued a papal bull, a formal document of papal authority titled In Eminenti. The bull forbade Roman Catholics from joining the Freemasons under pain of excommunication. This was not a mild suggestion. Excommunication was the most severe penalty in the Church's arsenal. It meant exclusion from the sacraments, from the life of the Church, from the community of the faithful. It was, in a very real theological sense, a declaration that the excommunicated person stood in danger of damnation.
Pope Clement's stated reasons were several. He was concerned about the secret nature of the oaths taken in Masonic lodges. The Church held that oaths should be public and made before a proper ecclesiastical authority, not in a private ceremony whose content was deliberately concealed. He was concerned about the mixing of men of all religious backgrounds in the lodge. This egalitarianism, which Masonry celebrated, looked to the Church like indifference to religious truth. He was concerned about the possibility that the lodges were being used for political purposes, hostile to established authority. And he was concerned more vaguely about whatever might be happening in those closed rooms. In Eminenti was followed by further condemnations. Pope Benedict XIV reaffirmed it in 1751. Leo XII condemned Freemasonry in 1825. Pius VIII condemned it in 1829. Gregory XVI condemned it in 1832, and so on through the 19th century, a long procession of papal documents, each repeating and intensifying the prohibition. In 1884, Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical, a full formal letter to the Church, titled Humanum Genus, which devoted 32 densely argued paragraphs to the condemnation of Freemasonry. Leo's argument was essentially that Freemasonry was the organized expression of naturalism, the philosophical view that the supernatural is either unreal or irrelevant, and that naturalism was the enemy of Christian civilization.
He argued that the Masons sought to secularize education, to remove religion from public life, to undermine the authority of the Church, and to promote a social order based on reason alone rather than divine revelation. He went so far as to suggest a connection between Freemasonry and Satanism, an accusation that was more political than theological, but that would stick to the organization's reputation for more than a century.
As recently as 1983, the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the successor to the Inquisition, though the modern name is considerably less alarming, reaffirmed that Catholics who joined Masonic associations were in a state of grave sin and could not receive Holy Communion. The prohibition remains in place today. It is worth pausing to consider why the Church felt, and still feels, so strongly about this. Freemasonry's stated values, brotherhood, charity, moral improvement, religious tolerance, do not on their surface seem like the values of a satanic conspiracy. The organization has never, in any credible historical record, worshipped any deity other than the grand architect of the universe. That deliberately vague, deliberately inclusive conception of the divine that allows men of all faiths to participate equally. The real issue, from the Church's perspective, was precisely the vagueness. Freemasonry's theological neutrality, its willingness to say that any sincere belief in a supreme being was sufficient, that no particular religious tradition had a monopoly on the truth, was deeply threatening to an institution whose entire authority rested on the claim to unique, exclusive, divinely revealed truth. A Catholic who sat in a lodge and treated a Protestant or a Jew as an equal brother, who prayed alongside them to the same unnamed God, was implicitly acknowledging that Catholic doctrine was not the only road to salvation. This was not a small thing. It was, from the Church's perspective, a fundamental error.
The Protestant churches had their own concerns, though they varied more widely by denomination. Some Protestant traditions tolerated or even embraced Freemasonry. Others condemned it with vigor almost equal to Rome's. The Presbyterian Church in Scotland, the Methodist Church in various periods, and many evangelical denominations have at various times expressed formal opposition to Masonic membership. Meanwhile, secular governments also found reasons to fear the organization. In France, the lodges became associated with revolutionary politics. The Enlightenment ideas about reason and equality that circulated in them were the same ideas that the revolutionaries of 1789 were advancing. Napoleon had a complicated relationship with Freemasonry. Several of his family members were deeply involved in it, and he used it as a tool of political management in the territories he controlled. But he was never entirely comfortable with an organization whose ultimate loyalty was to an abstract brotherhood rather than to his own imperial person. In Spain under Franco, in Italy under Mussolini, and in Germany under Hitler, Freemasonry was banned outright. Nazi persecution of Freemasons was systematic and brutal. An estimated 80,000 to 200,000 Freemasons were killed in Nazi concentration camps. In occupied France, Masonic lodges were dissolved, their records seized, and their members subjected to surveillance and arrest. The Nazis' hatred of Freemasonry was ideological. They saw it as an instrument of Jewish and cosmopolitan conspiracy. But it was also simply a hatred of anything that existed outside the total control of the state, that maintained a private loyalty and a private space that the regime could not penetrate.
The history of Freemasonry's persecution is, in this light, not evidence of the organization's sinister power. It is evidence of exactly the opposite. A small, largely philosophical fraternity committed to personal moral improvement and fraternal fellowship that was attacked again and again precisely because it represented something that tyranny cannot tolerate: the private, voluntary association of free men bound by conscience rather than compulsion. Part 11.
Freemasonry and the Enlightenment. Ideas in the Smoke-Filled Lodge. It is impossible to understand Freemasonry's explosion in the 18th century without understanding the Enlightenment. And it is equally impossible to fully understand the Enlightenment without acknowledging the role that Masonic lodges played in it. The Enlightenment, called by the French philosophers le siècle des Lumières, the century of lights, was a broad intellectual movement that swept across Europe and the Atlantic world from roughly the 1680s through the end of the 18th century. It was not a single school of thought, but a shared orientation towards reason and evidence as the foundations of knowledge, towards individual rights and democratic principles as the foundations of legitimate government, towards religious tolerance and secular inquiry as alternatives to the dogmatic authority of church and crown. It produced Voltaire and Rousseau in France, John Locke and David Hume in Britain, Immanuel Kant in Germany, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin in America. It produced the Encyclopedia, that massive revolutionary attempt to compile all human knowledge in a single work, and the Declaration of Independence and the Rights of Man. It was, in its scope and its consequences, one of the most transformative intellectual movements in human history. And in city after city, country after country, the Masonic Lodge was one of the spaces where it lived.
The reason is partly practical. The lodge offered something that the Enlightenment needed, a private, protected space for the discussion of ideas that were, in many contexts, dangerous. To question the divine right of kings in a lodge bound by oaths of secrecy, surrounded by brothers sworn to support each other, was considerably safer than questioning it in a public pamphlet or in conversation with strangers. The lodge was a protected forum for precisely the kind of frank, questioning, unorthodox intellectual exchange that the Enlightenment required. But the connection was deeper than mere convenience. The values of Freemasonry and the values of the Enlightenment were genuinely aligned. Both rejected the authority of tradition and hierarchy for its own sake. Both insisted on the dignity and rational capacity of the individual. Both believed in progress, in the idea that human beings could, through reason and effort, make themselves and their societies better. Both were skeptical of dogma, including religious dogma, while maintaining a respect for the spiritual dimension of human life. The Masonic Lodge, with its mixed membership of men from different classes and different faiths, was itself a kind of Enlightenment demonstration project. It proved in a small and practical way that the Enlightenment ideas could be lived, that a lawyer and a blacksmith, a Catholic and a Protestant, a nobleman and a merchant could sit in the same room and treat each other as equals, and the sky would not fall. In France, the lodges became particularly important as gathering places for the intellectual ferment that preceded the Revolution. The French Grand Orient Lodge, which had separated from the English Grand Lodge in 1773 to form its own independent governing body, admitted men across a wide social range, from aristocrats to members of the emerging middle class. In these lodges, the ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu circulated freely. Revolutionary sentiments, carefully veiled in Masonic language, were discussed and refined. In Britain, the lodges were somewhat less politically charged, at least on the surface. The English tradition emphasized the apolitical character of Freemasonry. The official position was that politics and religion were not discussed in the lodge. But the very existence of a space where social hierarchies were temporarily set aside, where a duke and a dustman were nominally equal, carried its own quiet political meaning in a society built on rigid class distinctions. The Enlightenment did something to Freemasonry that went beyond political influence. It gave the organization an intellectual seriousness and a philosophical ambition that distinguished it from other fraternal clubs and social organizations of the period. The Freemasons were not just drinking together and enjoying each other's company, though they did plenty of that too. They were engaged in a shared project of self-improvement and moral inquiry that connected them, at least in their own understanding, to the grand tradition of philosophical inquiry reaching back to ancient Greece. This was arguably the most lasting gift of the Enlightenment to Freemasonry. Not political revolution, not institutional influence, but the idea that belonging to the fraternity was an intellectual commitment as well as a social one, that being a Freemason meant something about how you thought and what you aspired to, not just about which meetings you attended.
Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was initiated into the craft in December of 1784 at a lodge in Vienna called Zur Wohltätigkeit, Beneficence. He was 28 years old, already one of the most celebrated composers in Europe, already working on the symphonies and operas that would cement his immortality. He took to Freemasonry with genuine enthusiasm. He attended lodge meetings regularly, composed Masonic music, including the Masonic funeral music, the cantatas, and later the pieces specifically written for lodge ceremonies, and recruited several of his friends and patrons into the order. His connection to Freemasonry is most visible in his opera The Magic Flute, completed in 1791, the year of his death. The opera is, on one level, a fairy tale with comic elements and a spectacular stage design. On another level, it is saturated with Masonic imagery and symbolism. The hero Tamino must pass through trials, tests of courage, silence, and moral resolve, before he is admitted to the Temple of Wisdom. The three ladies, the three boys, the threefold repetition of knocks, the emphasis on brotherhood and the pursuit of light, these elements are recognizable to any student of Masonic ritual, and Mozart put them in the most popular musical entertainment of his time. The Magic Flute has been performed continuously since its premiere. In a sense, Mozart gave Masonic symbolism a cultural immortality it could never have achieved in private lodge rooms alone. Joseph Haydn, Mozart's teacher and mentor, was also a Mason, as was Franz Liszt in a later generation. The lodges of the Enlightenment and early Romantic periods were extraordinarily fertile grounds for artistic and intellectual life, a fact that speaks well for the quality of conversation around their candle-lit tables.
Voltaire, perhaps the most famous of all the French Enlightenment thinkers, the man who spent his life as a gadfly against superstition and tyranny, was admitted into Freemasonry at the lodge known as the Nine Sisters in Paris in April of 1778, just weeks before his death at the age of 83. He was too weak to perform the complete ceremony and had to be assisted through parts of it. He died 2 months later, but he died a Mason, and the symbolism of his late admission was not lost on his contemporaries. Benjamin Franklin was initiated in Philadelphia and later served as Grand Master of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris, the same lodge that admitted Voltaire. In this role, Franklin sat at the center of an extraordinary network of Enlightenment thinkers, politicians, and artists. His Masonic connections in France were not incidental to his diplomatic work there, they were part of it. The lodge was a social technology,
and Franklin used it with his characteristic pragmatic brilliance. The Marquis de Lafayette, the French aristocrat who became one of the heroes of the American Revolution, a beloved figure in both France and the United States, was a prominent Freemason. His gift of the embroidered apron to George Washington was a specifically Masonic gesture, a token of brotherhood between two men who were connected not only by shared military experience, but by shared lodge membership.
Then there is Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's relationship with Freemasonry is complicated and fascinating. He himself was never formally initiated into the fraternity, though there are claims to the contrary, which most serious historians reject. But his family was deeply embedded in it. His brothers, Joseph, Lucien, and Louis, were all Freemasons. His brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, was a Freemason. Many of his most important marshals and ministers were Freemasons. Napoleon appears to have used Freemasonry deliberately as a tool of political consolidation. In the territories he conquered, Italy, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, he encouraged the formation of lodges whose membership would include local elites, binding them to the French imperial project through the shared bonds of the fraternity. He understood that the Masonic network could be a tool of governance, a way of creating loyalty and communication across diverse and recently conquered populations. But he was never entirely comfortable with what he could not control. The independent loyalty of Masons to each other, the private spaces of the lodge that even imperial authority could not fully penetrate, made him uneasy. He tolerated Freemasonry when it served his purposes and viewed it with suspicion when it did not. Winston Churchill was initiated into a London lodge in 1901 at the age of 26. He attended meetings sporadically and eventually drifted away from active membership. His Masonic career was not particularly distinguished, but the fact of it connects him to a tradition that includes most of the other major figures of British political and cultural life in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Duke Ellington, the great jazz composer and band leader, was a Mason. Count Basie was a Mason. Louis Armstrong was a Mason. The tradition of Black American Freemasonry, known as Prince Hall Freemasonry, after Prince Hall, who founded the first Black Masonic Lodge in America in 1784, deserves its own extended treatment, because it represents one of the most extraordinary chapters in the organization's history. A group of black men in 18th century America, systematically excluded from the white lodges that surrounded them, establishing their own Masonic tradition and maintaining it through the full horror of slavery and the long struggle of the civil rights era. Prince Hall Freemasonry produced leaders, thinkers, and activists in every generation. It was, in its own context, every bit as significant as the Founding Father Freemasonry that tends to dominate the historical narrative. Buzz Aldrin, the second human being to walk on the moon, is a Freemason. He carried a Masonic flag with him on the Apollo 11 mission. Somewhere in the archives of the Grand Lodge of Texas, there is a flag that has been to the moon and back. The roll call of famous Masons is not just trivia. It speaks to something real about what the organization offered and what it meant to the men who joined it across its 300-year history. It offered a community of serious men who took seriously the business of being human, of living ethically, of pursuing knowledge, of treating their fellows with dignity. In generation after generation, in country after country, men who were shaping the world around them found in that community something they couldn't quite find anywhere else. Part 13. The Anti-Masonic Movement and the Morgan Affair.
Not everyone was charmed.
From almost the moment modern Freemasonry appeared in the early 18th century, it attracted critics. Some were motivated by religious conviction, some by political suspicion, some by simple resentment of a closed organization that refused to explain itself. But the most dramatic moment of organized anti-Masonic sentiment in American history was triggered by a single ambiguous disappearance in upstate New York in the autumn of 1826. William Morgan was a bricklayer and sometimes stonemason from Batavia, New York. He claimed to have been a Freemason, though some lodges disputed this. He had fallen on hard times financially and had hit upon a commercial plan. He would write and publish a book exposing the secrets of Freemasonry, the secrets of all 3 degrees, the grips, the words, the ceremony, everything that lodge members were sworn to keep private. Whether Morgan was motivated by principle or by money is unclear, probably both. He found a publisher and word got out. The local Masonic community was not pleased. Complaints were made, legal maneuvering occurred, and then, in September of 1826, Morgan was seized by a group of men, bundled into a carriage, and taken to Fort Niagara on the shore of Lake Ontario. He was never seen again. What happened to William Morgan has never been definitively established. Whether he was murdered to prevent him from revealing Masonic secrets, whether he died by accident, whether he left the country voluntarily or was helped to disappear, none of this was ever proven. But the political impact of his disappearance was immediate and explosive. The suspicion that Masons had murdered Morgan to preserve their secrets lit a fuse in American public opinion. Several men were eventually tried for the abduction and received relatively light sentences, a fact that was itself taken as evidence of Masonic influence corrupting the justice system. The governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton, was a Mason. The judges and prosecutors involved in the case were, to varying degrees, connected to the fraternity. Whether or not the fraternity had actually protected its own, the appearance of protection was damning. Out of the Morgan affair grew the Anti-Masonic Party, the first significant third party in American political history. Founded in 1828, it ran candidates in local, state, and national elections on a platform that was essentially opposition to Freemasonry. It attracted genuine popular support in the northeastern states, particularly in rural areas, where the lodge was seen as an institution of elite privilege and corrupt insider dealing. John Quincy Adams, the former president, became one of its most prominent supporters. Thurlow Weed, the New York political operator, used it as a vehicle for his own ambitions. The Anti-Masonic Party held the first ever presidential nominating convention in American history in 1831 in Baltimore, a procedural innovation that, ironically, became the standard method for all subsequent American political parties. It also produced the first national party platform, another procedural innovation that outlasted the party itself.
The party faded by the mid-1830s, absorbed largely into the emerging Whig coalition. But the Morgan affair had done lasting damage to American Freemasonry. Membership declined sharply in the years following the scandal. Lodges in New York and New England found themselves publicly shamed and stripped of the social respectability that had been their most valuable asset. It took decades for American Freemasonry to fully recover. The Morgan affair is instructive, not so much for what it tells us about Freemasonry specifically, but for what it reveals about the dynamics of secret societies in democratic cultures. The strength of the lodge, its brotherhood, its insider networks, its culture of mutual protection, became in the Morgan affair its greatest liability. The same qualities that made Masonic membership valuable in ordinary times became evidence of corruption and conspiracy when something went wrong. The closed door that protected philosophical discussion, also in the public imagination, protected murderers. It is a tension that Freemasonry has never fully resolved, because it cannot be fully resolved. An organization that keeps secrets will always face the suspicion that what it is keeping secret is something worse than a symbolic handshake. The only answer Freemasonry has ever offered to this suspicion is its conduct, the charitable work, the public membership, the long record of ordinary men doing ordinary good. It is not a satisfying answer to the suspicious mind, but it may be the only honest one. Part 14. Persecution, Suppression, and the Lodges that Survived. The history of Freemasonry is not only a history of power and influence, it is also a history of survival under pressure, of lodges meeting in secret not because of ancient tradition, but because genuine mortal danger lay outside the door. The most severe persecution of Freemasons in modern history occurred under the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. In Nazi Germany, Freemasonry was classified as an enemy of the state, associated in the twisted ideological framework of National Socialism with both Judaism and communism. In 1934, all Masonic lodges in Germany were dissolved. Masonic regalia, records, and libraries were seized. Prominent Masons were arrested, and many were sent to concentration camps, where they were identified by a special badge, an inverted triangle, often in a combination of colors, that marked them as enemies of the Reich. The exact number of Freemasons who died in Nazi camps is disputed and difficult to determine, because camp records did not always distinguish between those imprisoned for Masonic membership and those imprisoned for other reasons. Estimates range widely, but serious historians who have studied the question believe the number may be in the tens of thousands. In occupied countries across Europe, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Masonic lodges were systematically suppressed, their members subjected to the full machinery of totalitarian persecution. In fascist Italy under Mussolini, Freemasonry was banned in 1925, shortly after Mussolini consolidated power. The ban was motivated partly by the Church's long-standing hostility and partly by Mussolini's own need to eliminate any private organization that maintained loyalties outside the control of the fascist state. Prominent Italian Masons, including several who had played important roles in the liberal political tradition that Mussolini was in the process of destroying, were publicly humiliated, forced to publicly renounce their membership, or jailed.
In Spain, under Franco, Freemasonry was made a criminal offense. The law of repression of Masonry and communism, passed in 1940, treated past membership in a Masonic lodge as equivalent to communist subversion. Simply having been a Mason in the years before the Civil War could result in imprisonment or even death. Franco himself had an obsessive personal hostility to Freemasonry. He wrote under the pseudonym Joachim Buhr a series of newspaper columns about what he claimed was the Masonic conspiracy against Spain. It is difficult to read these columns with a certain sad amazement at the paranoid certainty with which they describe the machinations of an organization that was, in Spain at least, a small group of professional men attending philosophy meetings. The Soviet Union banned Freemasonry almost immediately after the revolution, viewing it as a bourgeois organization with insufficient revolutionary credentials. In most communist countries through the 20th century, Masonic lodges were prohibited and membership was treated as evidence of subversive activity. In each of these cases, the pattern is consistent. A new authoritarian regime, whether fascist or communist, seizes power. Among its early acts is the suppression of voluntary associations that operate outside state control. trade unions, political parties, religious organizations, fraternal clubs. The Masonic Lodge, with its private membership, its secret rituals, its loyalty to principles rather than to any state authority, and its network of educated and influential members, makes an obvious target. The suppression follows almost inevitably. And in each case, Freemasonry survived. Not necessarily in the country of its persecution. Italian lodges did not operate openly during the fascist period. German lodges ceased to exist in Germany under the Nazis, but the institution survived, in exile, in clandestine form, or simply by waiting out the regime that had suppressed it. In Germany, after the defeat of National Socialism in 1945, Masonic lodges were re-established almost immediately. The surviving Masons returned, reconstituted their lodges, and took up again the business of conducting initiations and paying charitable obligations. There was something quietly extraordinary about this. Men who had survived concentration camps, who had watched their institution burned and their records seized and their brothers killed, putting on their aprons again and opening the lodge and beginning the ritual from the beginning. The persistence of Freemasonry under persecution is not, in itself, evidence that the organization is secretly powerful. It is evidence that the things the organization offered, fellowship, ritual, philosophical community, the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself, were considered genuinely worth preserving by the men who had received them. Part 15. Conspiracy Theories. What people believe and why. We cannot tell the full story of Freemasonry without spending time in the shadow world of conspiracy theories, because that shadow world is not incidental to the organization's history. It is, in a strange way, part of it. The conspiracy theories about Freemasonry are themselves a historical phenomenon, rooted in real circumstances and real anxieties, and understanding them is part of understanding what Freemasonry has meant to the cultures that have housed it. The basic anatomy of a Masonic conspiracy theory is consistent across time and culture. It begins with an established fact. Freemasonry is a secretive organization with private rituals, insider networks, and a membership that has included many powerful and influential people. It adds an inference. If powerful people meet secretly and swear oaths of loyalty to each other, they must be coordinating the exercise of that power for private ends. It concludes with a claim. Freemasonry controls governments, financial systems, judicial appointments, the press, and the ultimate direction of human civilization. The evidence offered for these claims is typically the same kind of evidence that any closed organization generates in abundance. The appearance of Masonic symbols in unexpected places, the coincidence of Masonic membership among figures involved in significant events, the inability of non-members to say definitively what goes on behind the closed door. In the logic of conspiracy theory, absence of evidence is itself evidence. If you can't prove it isn't happening, that means it is. The most elaborate and enduring version of the Masonic conspiracy theory connects Freemasonry to the Illuminati. The Bavarian Illuminati was a real organization, founded in 1776 by a Bavarian professor named Adam Weishaupt. It was explicitly an Enlightenment organization, dedicated to promoting reason, secularism, and opposition to religious and monarchical authority. It attracted educated men across Central Europe, some of whom were also Freemasons, though the Illuminati was a separate organization with its own structure and purposes. The Bavarian government suppressed it in 1785, and it effectively ceased to exist as an organized body within a few years of its founding. In the conspiracy theories, the Illuminati never died. They merely went underground, infiltrating Freemasonry and using its network as a vehicle for a centuries-long plan to establish a secret world government. The French Revolution was their first major operation. The American Revolution was another. Every significant political upheaval of the modern era, both world wars, the Russian Revolution, the establishment of the United Nations, the creation of the European Union, the September 11 attacks, has been attributed, in various versions of the theory, to the coordinated action of this Illuminati Masonic conspiracy. This is not history, it is mythology. Not mythology in the pejorative sense, not simply falsehood, but mythology in the deeper sense, a narrative that explains the world in terms of hidden agency and ultimate meaning, that converts the chaos and contingency of historical events into a coherent story with identifiable villains and discernible purpose. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, and nothing generates more pressing patterns than the combination of real secrecy, real power, and real historical turbulence. There have been genuine instances of Masonic networks being used for corrupt purposes. The Propaganda Due Lodge in Italy, known as P2, is the most notorious. Founded in the mid-20th century and led by a man named Licio Gelli, P2 was not a regular Masonic lodge in any meaningful sense. It operated outside the normal Masonic structure, accepting members without the knowledge or approval of the Italian Grand Lodge, and it functioned as a genuine right-wing political network, with members including prominent politicians, military officers, intelligence officials, and organized crime figures. When its existence was exposed in 1981, it caused a major political scandal and contributed to the fall of several Italian governments. P2 is real. It was genuinely corrupt, and it used Masonic structures and language for non-Masonic purposes. It is appropriately cited as an instance of Masonic organizational culture being exploited for political manipulation. But it is not representative of Freemasonry generally, any more than the mafia's use of Catholic sacramental language makes Catholicism a criminal organization. The persistence and vitality of Masonic conspiracy theories tells us something important, not about the Freemasons, but about the societies that produce these theories. The theories flourish in times and places characterized by rapid social change, by anxiety about the distribution of power, by distrust of established institutions, and by the sense that important decisions are being made by people who are not accountable to the ordinary citizen. In those conditions, the image of a secret brotherhood of powerful men conducting mysterious rituals and swearing loyalty to each other becomes an attractive explanation for why things are going wrong. It provides an enemy with a face, or at least with an apron. The irony is that the actual Freemasonry, the small lodges in unremarkable buildings where retired professionals meet to recite century-old rituals and raise money for local charities, is about as far from world domination as it is possible to imagine, while still wearing a ceremonial collar. Part 16. Freemasonry Today. What Remains of the Ancient Brotherhood.
And so we arrive at the present, or close enough to it. The lodges are still meeting. Not as many as before. Membership in Freemasonry, like membership in most traditional fraternal organizations, has declined significantly since its peak in the mid-20th century, but they are still there. In cities and small towns across the United Kingdom and the United States and Australia and Canada and India and across Europe, in countries where the organization operates openly, and in a few countries where it still faces legal restrictions, the lodges are still meeting, still performing the degrees, still gathering around the square and compass, still calling each other brother. The United Grand Lodge of England, which traces its institutional lineage to the founding meeting at the Goose and Gridiron in 1717, remains the oldest Grand Lodge in the world. Its headquarters is Freemasons' Hall on Great Queen Street in London, a magnificent Art Deco building completed in 1933 and dedicated as a memorial to the Freemasons who died in the First World War. Inside it, there are multiple lodge rooms, ranging from intimate chambers to an enormous grand temple that can seat 1,000 people, its ceiling coffered in gold, and its walls hung with the banners of lodges from across the jurisdiction. It is a building that manages to be both deeply peculiar and genuinely beautiful, which seems appropriate.
Estimates of worldwide Masonic membership vary considerably, but reliable figures suggest somewhere between 2 and 6 million members globally, with the largest concentrations in the United States and the United Kingdom. This is a significant decline from the peak years of the early and mid-20th century, when American Freemasonry alone claimed more than 4 million members. The decline mirrors the decline in membership across virtually all traditional fraternal and civic organizations, the Rotary Clubs, the Knights of Columbus, the Lions, the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Something has changed in the social fabric, and voluntary organizations that once occupied a central place in community life now find themselves competing with entertainment, social media, and the general fragmentation of public life. The Freemasonry that survives today is, in many ways, a changed institution from the one that George Washington wore an apron for, or Mozart composed music for. It is smaller, older on average, less politically central, less mysterious to those outside it. The rituals, preserved in careful detail, are performed in buildings that were once impressive and are now sometimes simply old. The great questions of the Enlightenment that once animated the lodge's discussions have been resolved, or replaced by new questions, or simply passed to other institutions.
And yet, the men who still attend the lodges, and there are new, younger members joining, even now, drawn by the same things that have always drawn men to the craft. They describe something that is harder to explain than conspiracy, and more difficult to dismiss than mere nostalgia. They describe the experience of performing a ritual that is centuries old, of speaking words that have been spoken in the same way by men going back through generations, of being bound by oath to a set of principles that the modern world does not always honor: honesty, charity, brotherhood, the cultivation of virtue. They describe the experience of sitting in a lodge room late at night, after the ceremony, with men they have come to know not through accident of birth or circumstance, but through shared choice and shared commitment, and feeling, however briefly, that they are part of something larger and older and more serious than the ordinary course of daily life. This is what has always been at the heart of it, not the conspiracy, not the symbols, not the political influence, not the famous members. At the heart of it is this: the very old, very human need to belong to something meaningful, to be tested and found worthy, to receive knowledge that has been carefully preserved, and to swear to preserve it in turn, to call a stranger brother and mean it, to mark the passage of time with ritual, rather than simply letting it slip by unnoticed. The stone that the ancient builders shaped is still there, in all the cathedrals that have survived the centuries. You can see the marks of the mason's tools in it if you look closely enough. You can see the precision of the cuts, the care of the proportions, the evidence of a knowledge that was passed from hand to hand across generations, held carefully, transmitted faithfully. The men who cut those stones are long gone. Their names are mostly forgotten, but the work remains, and in the work, something of them remains too. The lodge in its long history has been many things to many people. It has been a trade guild and a philosophical society and a political network and a mystery school and a charitable organization and a target for persecution and a vehicle for some, frankly, very silly conspiracy theories. It has included great men and ordinary men and men who fell far short of the ideals they swore to uphold. It has had its corruptions and its frauds and its moments of shameful hypocrisy. But it has also, in its 300 years of modern existence, and in the centuries of stonemason tradition that preceded those 300 years, done something genuine and worthwhile. It has created spaces where men were asked to be better than they were, where the highest aspiration was not wealth or status or power, but moral improvement, intellectual growth, and the humble acknowledgement that there is always more to learn, where the appropriate response to a stranger was not suspicion but welcome, not exclusion but the extended hand of brotherhood.
That is not nothing. In a world that has spent most of its history dividing people into opposing camps and teaching them to fear each other, an institution that has persistently, if imperfectly, tried to do the opposite deserves at least a measure of respect. The door of the lodge is still there, still closed to those who have not knocked, still opening slowly to those who do. Part 17. The Architecture of Belief. Masonic Buildings, Cities, and Hidden Geometry. There is a particular pleasure in walking through an old city and knowing how to read it. Not the obvious reading, the plaques on buildings, the names of streets, the statues of long-dead heroes in public squares, but the deeper reading, the one that requires knowing a little about how cities were designed and by whom and what they were trying to say. Freemasonry left its marks on the physical world in ways that go well beyond the lodge room. The organization's centuries-long obsession with geometry, proportion, and the moral meaning of architectural forms translated in some remarkable instances into actual buildings and actual cities laid out according to principles that the designers considered deeply significant. The most famous example is naturally Washington, D.C. The American capital was laid out in the 1790s by a French engineer named Pierre-Charles Lafont, assisted by the surveyor Andrew Ellicott. George Washington, who oversaw the project, was a Mason. Lafont was almost certainly a Mason. Ellicott, who completed the survey after Lafont was dismissed, was a Mason. The cornerstone laying ceremonies for the major buildings, the Capitol, the White House, and others, were conducted with Masonic ritual. And the street plan of the city contains geometric relationships that have been endlessly analyzed for hidden Masonic meaning.
The most persistent of these analyses focuses on the diagonal avenues that L'Enfant laid over the standard grid. When certain avenues are traced on a map, they can be made to form geometric shapes, triangles, pentagrams, other figures that resemble Masonic symbols. This has been taken by many conspiracy-minded observers as conclusive evidence that Washington was deliberately designed as a Masonic city, its very geography encoding a secret message. The more prosaic explanation, favored by most architectural historians, is that l'Enfant was working within the standard European tradition of Baroque city planning, which favored grand diagonal avenues radiating from central points, precisely because they were visually dramatic and practically useful for moving troops and supplies. The diagonal avenues of Paris, Vienna, and other European capitals were designed by men who were not necessarily Masons for the same reasons. And the geometric figures that can be found in the Washington street plan are in most cases imprecise. They require selecting certain streets and ignoring others, and the resulting shapes are approximate rather than exact. They look more like the result of reading patterns into a complex geometric grid than of deliberate hidden encoding. But the Masonic cornerstone ceremonies are real, and they tell us something genuine. The decision to mark the founding of the American capital with Masonic ritual was not incidental. It was a deliberate statement about the values the founders wanted to associate with their new republic. The square and compass at the cornerstone were not just decoration, they were a declaration. This building, this city, this republic is being built on the same principles as the lodge, on reason and moral purpose, on the honest angle and the true proportion, on the aspiration towards something better than what the builders themselves yet are.
The Freemasons' Hall in London, already mentioned, is itself an extraordinary architectural statement. Completed in 1933 and dedicated as a memorial to the Masons lost in World War I, it was designed by H.V. Ashley and F. Winton Newman in a style that blends Art Deco modernity with the symbolic vocabulary of the ancient lodge. The exterior is massive and somewhat austere, grand without being showy. Inside, the Grand Temple is one of the most remarkable ceremonial spaces in Britain, its ceiling a vast coffered dome, its walls lined with the banners of English lodges, its light filtering from windows of deep-coloured glass that give the space a quality of illumination that is deliberately, carefully otherworldly. Masonic lodge rooms generally, wherever they are in the world, follow a consistent design principle. The room is an enclosed world, oriented by compass direction, designed to focus the attention of the people inside it on the symbolic drama being performed. The black and white checkered floor, present in many traditional lodge rooms, creates a visual environment of deliberate duality, a reminder that the world contains both light and darkness, and that the Mason's task is to navigate between them with integrity. The tracing boards, large illustrated panels displayed in the lodge during ceremonies, are elaborate visual summaries of the moral and philosophical content of each degree, designed to be contemplated quietly while the ceremony proceeds around them.
The Masonic tracing board for the first degree typically shows a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, the sun and moon and 7 stars, the 2 pillars, Boaz and Jachin, and the rough and smooth ashlars, the rough stone representing the uninitiated candidate, the smooth stone representing the perfected Mason. The second degree board typically shows the winding staircase of Solomon's Temple, with the 7 steps of the liberal arts rising toward the middle chamber, where the fellow craft receives his wages. The third degree board is darker, more austere, a coffin, a sprig of acacia, the tools of the master mason, the symbols of mortality and resurrection that are the themes of the degree. These boards are beautiful objects, often painted with considerable skill, and they carry within them the complete visual curriculum of Masonic instruction. Looking at them, even without understanding all the references, you can sense the seriousness of the philosophical project they represent, the ambition to create a complete moral and intellectual education out of the tools and stories of an ancient craft. Beyond the lodge room itself, Masonic architecture includes some notable public works. The George Washington Masonic National Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia, a tower modeled on the ancient lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, rises 333 feet above the surrounding landscape and houses multiple lodge rooms, an auditorium, and extensive collections of Masonic art and artifacts. It stands as a kind of monument to American Freemasonry's self-understanding, a claim to be part of the same tradition of wisdom-seeking and knowledge-preserving that stretches back to the ancient world.
Solomon's Temple, the symbolic center of all Masonic architecture, was itself never built by Freemasons. It was built, according to the Bible, by actual workers in the ancient Near East around the 10th century before the Common Era. But in the Masonic imagination, it is eternally present, eternally under construction. Every lodge is a symbolic Solomon's Temple. Every initiation is a new builder being welcomed into the ongoing work. The temple is never quite finished because the work of moral and intellectual improvement is never quite finished. There is always another stone to be shaped, another rough place to be smoothed, another joint to be made true. This is perhaps the deepest architectural metaphor in all of Freemasonry, the idea that we are all, individually and collectively, engaged in an eternal construction project, that the building we are actually building is not made of stone but of character, that the tools we need for it are not physical but moral, and that the plans for it, though they were drawn up long ago by minds far greater than our own, are still legible to anyone who knows how to read them. Part 18. The Secret Lives of Masonic Women, Orders, History, and the Long Road In. For most of its history, Freemasonry has been an exclusively male organization. The Anderson Constitutions of 1723 explicitly specified that members must be free men, and the tradition of excluding women has persisted in most mainstream Masonic jurisdictions to the present day. But the story of women and Freemasonry is more complex, more interesting, and more contested than the simple fact of exclusion suggests.
From very early in the history of modern Freemasonry, there were women who wanted to be part of it. The lodge's combination of philosophical seriousness, ritual depth, and fraternal fellowship was not, after all, an exclusively masculine appeal. The same qualities that drew educated, thoughtful men to the craft were equally appealing to educated, thoughtful women, of whom there were, by the 18th century, a significant number, particularly in France. The most famous early case is that of Elizabeth Aldworth, an Irish noblewoman who is said to have been initiated into a lodge, Doneraile Court Lodge in County Cork, Ireland, in the early 18th century. The legend, which may be true or may be embellished, holds that Aldworth, who was then a young woman, hid in a wall cavity and observed a Masonic ceremony without the knowledge of the lodge members, including her father. When she was discovered, the lodge members faced a dilemma. Having seen the secrets of the degree, she was a security risk. Their solution was to initiate her, binding her to the same oath of secrecy as the other members. Whether this story is precisely accurate or not, and there are documented records of Aldworth's membership in the lodge which lend it more credibility than most origin legends, it illustrates the fundamental tension. The lodge was not designed for women and operated on assumptions that excluded them. But women were curious, intelligent, and interested in what was happening behind those closed doors, and occasionally the doors opened.
In France, a separate system called the adoptive rite developed in the mid-18th century. Adoptive lodges were associated with regular men's lodges, but admitted women as members. Their rituals drew on Masonic symbolism, but were specifically designed for mixed-gender gatherings, and they became fashionable in French aristocratic circles during the second half of the 18th century. Marie Antoinette was associated with at least one adoptive lodge. Empress Josephine, Napoleon's wife, was a member of an adoptive lodge. These gatherings were partly social affairs, but they also gave women access to something that the regular lodges provided for men: a ritually structured community with philosophical aspirations and a sense of shared belonging. The adoptive rites did not survive in their original form, though they left traces in various mixed-gender and women's Masonic organizations that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. In France, the mixed-gender order Le Droit Humain, Human Rights, was founded in 1893 by a feminist activist named Maria de Rahims and the politician George Martin, and admitted both men and women on entirely equal terms. It remains active today, operating internationally. In England, the Honourable Fraternity of Ancient Freemasons, an all-women's order, was founded in 1908 and continues to operate. The Order of Women Freemasons, another English body, follows the same three-degree structure as regular Freemasonry and maintains similar standards and practices. Neither of these organizations is recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England, which maintains that regular Freemasonry is exclusively for men. But both are genuine Masonic orders in every meaningful sense. They perform the same degrees, maintain the same symbols and principles, and have produced generations of initiated women who consider themselves fully and properly Freemasons.
The question of women's admission has been one of the most contentious issues in modern Freemasonry. The arguments against admission have generally drawn on tradition, the claim that Freemasonry has always been a fraternal organization, and that changing this would fundamentally alter its character. The arguments for admission draw on the organization's own stated principles. If Freemasonry genuinely believes in the equal dignity of all human beings, in the irrelevance of social distinctions to moral worth, then the exclusion of half the human race from membership is a rather glaring inconsistency. Some jurisdictions have moved toward full gender integration. In many American jurisdictions, mixed gender bodies associated with Freemasonry, the Eastern Star, for instance, which admits both men and women and operates with Masonic ritual and symbolism, have long been active. The Eastern Star was established in the mid-19th century and at its peak was one of the largest fraternal organizations in the United States, with millions of members. It was not technically a Masonic body. Regular Freemasonry still required male-only lodges as the foundation of membership, but it gave women a significant and meaningful connection to the Masonic tradition. The conversation about gender in Freemasonry is ongoing, and the organization's various jurisdictions around the world are at different stages of it. What is certain is that the women who sought admission to the lodge over 3 centuries were not doing so merely for social reasons. They were seeking, just as the men were seeking, that particular combination of ritual seriousness and philosophical depth and genuine brotherhood, or sisterhood, or simply human fellowship that the lodge offered and that the rest of the world so often failed to provide. Closing. The last stone.
And so here we are, at the end of a very long corridor, having travelled together through more than 7 centuries of stone and shadow and smoke and candlelight and ceremony. We began in the cold mud of a medieval building site, in the company of men who shaped stone with their hands and passed their knowledge down through whispers and grips and the weight of sworn oaths. We passed through lodge rooms and taverns and presidential estates and concert halls. We sat with Mozart as he heard the first knock at the lodge door, and walked beside George Washington as he laid a cornerstone in his apron
on a piece of land that would become a capital city. We watched popes sign their condemnations and tyrants dissolve their lodges, and ordinary men put on their aprons again after the wars were over and begin the ritual once more from the beginning. 700 years of stone and shadow and candlelight and ceremony and brotherhood and secrecy and misunderstanding and persistence. At the beginning of it, men with rough hands and dusty clothes, cutting stone in the cold shadow of a cathedral that was still mostly just a drawing on parchment. At the end of it, a quiet lodge room somewhere in a city you probably know, where a handful of men in white aprons are performing, once again, a ceremony that has not changed very much in 300 years.
In between there is everything, the Grand Lodge of England and the American founding and the papal bulls and Mozart in his Vienna lodge and the battles against tyrants who feared a closed door and the conspiracy theories that mistook symbolism for sinister power, and the ordinary, undramatic business of men sitting together after the ceremony and simply being human to each other. The thing that strikes you most when you follow this story to its end is not the mystery. It is the continuity. The grip that a Mason in London in 1723 learned in his lodge is the same grip that a Mason in Sydney or Chicago or Cape Town learns today. The words are the same. The room is arranged the same way. The story of Hiram Abiff is told the same way, with the same symbolic gravity, before the same symbolically arrayed tools and pillars and lights. There is something remarkable in that, a thread of preserved meaning passed hand to hand across 3 centuries and into the present. Most things do not survive that long. Most organizations, most ideas, most rituals fade and dissolve within a few generations, absorbed by time and change. The fact that this one has not, that it was already old when Mozart joined it and is still here, still meeting, still performing its slow and serious ceremony by candlelight, says something, not about conspiracy, not about power, about the stubbornness of certain human needs.
The need for ritual, for brotherhood, for the sense that we are connected to something larger than our individual lives, for the reminder, delivered with appropriate solemnity by men in white aprons, that we are here to improve ourselves, not just materially, not just intellectually, but morally, that we are rough stones and the work of our lives is to become smooth ones. The cathedral builders knew this, the stonemasons in their cold lodges knew this, the Enlightenment philosophers who put on Masonic aprons over their fine coats knew this. And somewhere tonight, in a building you have probably walked past without a second glance, men are knowing it again. The door is closed, the candles are lit, and the work, as it has always been, is beginning. If you've made it this far, or if you drifted away somewhere in the middle and are just surfacing now, groggy and warm and pleasantly confused about where the centuries went, welcome back. I hope the story carried you somewhere quiet and restful tonight. The Freemasons, for all their secrets and all their shadows, are fundamentally a story about people trying, quietly and persistently, to be better. And that seems like a good story to drift off to. If these slow journeys through history are doing something good for your nights, please take just a moment, if you're still awake enough, to leave a like on this video, or a comment, or subscribe to the channel. We are working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins us is making this little corner of the internet a little more real. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Tell me if you're warm. Tell me if you made it all the way through. And if you have any sleepy hype left in you tonight, send it this way. It means more than you know. Good night. Sleep well. The lodge is closed for the evening, and the candles, one by one, are going out.